welcome to Terrific Tidepools. My name is Kara, and we're going to wait just a few moments for a bunch of people to hop on, and then we will go ahead and get started.
Like there's 6 viewers right now, so we can go ahead and get started.
Perfect, then let's get going. My name is Kara, and behind the camera are Josh and Veronica. And we are with an organization called Explore Ecology, and we're here today thanks to Santa Barbara County's Project Clean Water. Explore Ecology is a really cool organization because we get to go around to a bunch of different schools in the county and teach kids just like you guys about our environment. So we teach about things like water quality, waste reduction, and tide pools. So that's what we're going to be learning about today at Terrific Tidepools. So let me tell you how our event is going to work today. I am going to be leading you guys through the tide pools, talking about what makes a tide pool, and taking a look at some of the creatures that call these places home. And throughout the event, if you have any questions, teachers, you can go ahead and type them in the chat. I will be taking breaks throughout to answer your guys' questions. And if I don't get to your question today, don't worry, because we are going to be writing down all the questions, typing up some answers, and sending them back to your classes. So all of your questions will be answered. So with that being said, I think we can go ahead and get started. I want to first start out by talking about where we are today. So I am here at Coal Oil Point in Goleta, California. And this reserve is right next to UC Santa Barbara, so you might even see a little bit of the campus in the background there. Coal Oil Point is also located on the Santa Barbara Channel. So this ocean off to my left is called the Santa Barbara Channel. And it's a really important part on our Earth because there's lots of biodiversity. There's a lot of different animals and plants and algae that call this place home, or that move through the Santa Barbara Channel. So it's a really great opportunity to see a bunch of different wildlife. Now, one more really cool thing about Coal Oil Point Reserve is that it is a marine protected area, or an MPA. And what that means is that the plants and animals and the habitat here are protected. And there are actually 124 different MPAs in California. And they each have a couple of different rules about what you can and cannot do. So here at Coal Oil Point, you can swim, you can explore the tide pools, you can even surf, but we are not allowed to take anything from this beach. So everything that I show you today is going to be left here at the end of our presentation. And MPAs, marine protected areas, are really, really important to give animals a safe space to live. And that's especially important for endangered animals. So the first thing that I want to show you guys today is an endangered animal. So here I have an abalone shell. Let me get a little closer to the camera. Here I have an abalone shell. And I did not actually find this on the beach here today. I brought it with me to show you guys. There are 7 different species of abalone in California, and all 7 of them are actually endangered. Now, abalone are a type of sea snail. So right now we're looking at the inside of the shell. This is where the snail's body would be. And now that this is just a shell, we can take a look at the inside and see that it is really shiny and colorful and smooth. It is very, very beautiful. It's actually used in art and jewelry. So a really beautiful inside of the shell, which is different than the outside. So I'm going to go ahead and flip it over to the outside. We can see that there's not as much color on the outside, and it's a bit more textured. And that helps the abalone to blend into their environment. It helps to keep the abalone safe. So as I mentioned, abalone are an endangered animal, and the reason for that is because they were over-harvested. Here in California, we would hunt abalone for food and export it all around the world. But unfortunately, we took too many abalone out of the wild, and now they are classified as endangered. And that means that abalone are protected. So even if you're not in an MPA, you're not allowed to take abalone from the wild. So again, this just shows us how important these MPAs are for these animals. Gives them a safe place to try and rebound and thrive out in nature. All right. I'm going to go ahead and take a step back here. And I want to talk a little bit about tide pools. So tide pools are in an ecosystem called the intertidal. And the intertidal ecosystem is where the land meets the ocean. And it is really heavily influenced by the tide, so the water going in and out throughout the day. So at high tide, much of the intertidal is covered by water. And then as the tide goes out, these rocky areas are exposed, leaving tide pools that we can explore. And because the tides are constantly changing throughout the day, there are a lot of other stuff that's constantly changing in the intertidal as well. Biotic factors and abiotic factors. So I want to talk a little bit about what that means. So biotic means living. So living factors are things like predators and prey and competition between species. So biotic is living, and that means abiotic is non-living. So factors like the sunlight and the wind and the pounding waves, these are all things that the animals in the intertidal experience. And that makes living in the intertidal a little bit of a challenge sometimes. They have to have a lot of adaptations to help them survive this changing environment. Now I want to go ahead and take a look at some animals that we found here in the tide pool today. I'm going to come over here and grab our first animal for us. And this is one that a lot of us might be a little bit familiar with. And that is the hermit crab. Can we see it? Alright. So hermit crabs are a really common thing that we might find in the intertidal. And they're a really interesting kind of crab because most crabs grow their shells as part of their bodies, but hermit crabs do not. Instead, they have a soft body, and they need to find discarded shells to live in, to use for shelter and protection. And as the hermit crab gets bigger and bigger, they have to find larger and larger shells. So that's one reason why it's really great that Coal Oil Point is a no-take beach, meaning that we can't take the shells and rocks here, because that gives plenty of shells for these hermit crabs to find and use as shelter and protection. Oh, he's moving around. I'm going to go ahead and put this friend back in the water. As you can see, they're really cool animals. Alright, let's put him back in the water. I think he wants to go back in there. And instead we can take a look at another type of crab. So, hermit crabs find their shells, but most other crabs grow their shells. And this is a crab that grows their shells. This is a red rock crab. And what we're looking at here is actually the molt of a red rock crab. So, as the crabs grow larger, they actually shed their entire body and grow a whole new shell and legs as well. So you might find molts left on the beach from this getting washed up ashore. And these red rock crabs can actually get a lot bigger than what I'm showing you right now. They can grow to be about 8 inches wide. So I've seen some pretty big ones, but this is a nice, cute, small one. Alright, I'm going to step back here. And I'd like us to next take a look at some animals that we find living on the rocks in the intertidal. So this is one of my favorites. It is the anemone. So anemones are really, really cool creatures, and they look different when they're underwater versus when they are above water. So when an anemone is underneath the water, they kind of look like a plant. They have these tentacles that they use to grab their prey. But when they are outside of the water, they kind of close themselves up. And we can see them on the rocks here. It's kind of hard to see because they have these layers of shells and rocks covering them. But these are all tiny little anemones. Yeah, and here we've got some more that are closed up. And then underneath the water, there's one that we can see is open. You can see a little bit of its tentacles. And again, those are stinging tentacles that they use to grab things to eat. So, anemones eat things like small crabs and plankton. So plankton is anything that can't swim against the current. And usually that's really, really tiny microscopic plants and animals. So the anemone uses their stinging arms, their stinging tentacles to grab their food. And as I said, when they're outside of the water, they close up. And that is to protect the anemone from some of the harsh conditions in the intertidal. So they actually have this layer of shells and rocks that make them a little bit hard to identify, but they're all over here. And this layer of shell and rock kind of acts like a sunscreen for the anemone. It protects them from the sun's rays. And it also camouflages them, so it hides them from predators. So this is a really cool characteristic that these anemones have to help them survive in the intertidal. Alright, let's take a quick break and answer some of your guys' questions.
Okay, the first question is, why does the abalone have holes?
Why does the abalone have holes? That is a great question. Let me bring the shell up so we can see if we missed the holes. They have these holes along the shell. And I'm actually not entirely certain why they have these holes on their shell. My guess is that so they can maybe send some parts of their body out to feel the world around them.
Yeah, they also have those holes to take in air and also for excrement. So they are going to be sending all of their excrement after they've eaten out of those holes, and that's also where they're going to be taking in water and therefore also the air bubbles in the water to breathe.
Gotcha. Okay, so these holes here are used to bring water in and send waste out. So now we know. Thank you, Veronica.
We've got a few more questions as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next question, basically, are any shells that we find grown by the animals themselves, and how do they get those shells?
Yeah, so the shells that you would find on the beach are grown as part of an animal's body. Mostly they are snail shells. So that hard outer shell is something that the snails grow to protect them and keep them safe because their bodies are actually quite soft. And then when a snail passes away, these shells are left. And some other animals, like hermit crabs, can use those shells for themselves. So some animals grow their own shells and others do not.
Amazing. Okay, the next question is, how do anemones digest their food?
Ooh, that is a really interesting question. So the anemone is kind of a circular animal, and right in the middle of that circle is their mouths. So they use their stinging tentacles to grab their food, they drag it towards their mouth, and then they digest it right underneath their mouth. And what's actually interesting is anemones have what are called an incomplete gut. So their food goes in that center hole, and their waste comes out that same hole. So that is a little bit about how anemones digest their food. Kind of interesting.
Amazing. We've got one last anemone question,
okay,
and then we're going to move on, and we'll answer some more questions later. How big can anemones grow?
Ooh, how big can anemones grow? That's a really great question. The biggest ones I've seen are about this big. And I'm not sure, it definitely depends on the species. There are some species that are giant anemones, so they'll probably grow even bigger than that. And others, like these ones that are on the rocks here, stay quite small. So it depends on the species. But I can say one interesting thing about anemones is that some species of anemones live to be about 100 years old. So I assume that those ones can grow pretty big since they have so much time to grow. Alright. I think we will go ahead and move on and talk about some more tide pool animals. And we're going to be taking a look at these rocks over here because lots of animals live in these rocks. The first animal I want to talk about is the California mussel. So really quickly I'll show you guys what their shells look like so you know what we're looking for on the rock. They've got these like dark blue shells, and these are called bivalves. So they have two shells that they can open and close. And I actually have a clamshell that is a little bit more intact so I can show you what I'm talking about. But this is a bivalve. So there's two shells that can open and close. Just like that. And mussels, like clams, are bivalves. So I only have one side of the shell here, but you can imagine that there would be another side as well. Now let's take a look at these animals on the rocks. So we've got some small ones here. Some small California mussels, some bigger ones back here as well. And these California mussels are sessile. What that means is that they attach themselves to a rock and they don't really move much in their life. So they do that by using these filaments. Let me see if I can grab this one here. So we've got this string right here. This is called a basal filament. And this is what these mussels use to attach themselves to the rock. And they are actually attached so well and they're so strong that researchers at UCSB are trying to recreate these basal filaments to use them in our lives as well. So that's a really cool way that we are inspired by nature, is by these California mussels and their basal filaments. Now, California mussels are filter feeders. So that means that they are pumping the water in and out of their shell, and they are filtering out the plankton that are in it. They can also filter out any gross stuff that's in the water as well. So California mussels have a really important role in our environment. They help to keep our water clean. Now, another animal that lives on this rock here is the barnacle. So we can see there's a bunch of tiny little barnacles all on this rock. Here are some bigger ones here if you want to focus on these ones here. And these barnacles are also sessile. So they attach themselves to the rocks, but in a little bit of a different way than the mussels. So underneath their shells here, they actually make a cement-like glue. And that's what helps them to stick to the rocks. And just like the California mussel, the cement-like glue is so strong, researchers are also trying to recreate it. Now, the reason why it's beneficial for these animals to be sessile, to be stuck to the rock, is because it helps them to survive the pounding waves that can happen in the intertidal while the tides are changing. So because they are stuck to the rock, these animals don't fly off. Instead, they can stay nice and safe attached to some hard rock instead. All right, awesome. Well, one more animal I would like to talk about that lives on these rocks is a type of snail, and that is the limpet snail. So I've got a couple of shells from the limpets that I would like to show you. So these are two different kinds of limpets here. We've got a smaller one and a larger one. And limpets are really cool because they are kind of like the farmers of the intertidal. So they will find a nice area of rock that's clear of other animals, and they will farm or eat the algae from that rock. So they'll go back and forth eating up all the algae. And what's interesting is that the slime that the snail leaves behind as it moves actually helps more algae to grow. So they can kind of replenish their food source in that way, which is really, really awesome. They're great farmers. All right. And we will take a break for some more questions. Let's hear them.
All right, we've got lots of questions on what you just covered.
Okay.
First thing is, how big is the biggest barnacle?
How big is the biggest barnacle? That is a great question. So barnacles can live on rocks. They can live on boats. They can live on shells of other animals. They can even live on whales. So I imagine that the barnacles that live on whales are a lot bigger than the ones on here. But I'm not quite sure how big they get. Maybe like this big is a guess. That's my best guess, though.
All right, next question. What would happen if you stuck your finger in the anemone's mouth? So I'm guessing that's just in the center of the anemone.
Oh, yeah. So we definitely don't want to stick our finger in the center of the anemone's mouth. It wouldn't hurt us. They don't have any teeth. But it could really hurt the anemone. That's a very sensitive part of their body. So we definitely want to leave them alone, not touch them in their mouth. Same like you wouldn't want a stranger sticking their fingers in your mouth either. So my advice is to not do that, just to keep the anemone safe.
Amazing. The next few questions are about mussels.
Mussels.
How do mussels reproduce if they're always stuck to a rock?
Oh, that's a great question. So mussels and a lot of other sea animals do something called broadcast spawning. So they send their eggs and their sperm out in the water, and then they can meet in the water and form a little plankton that will drift along and eventually settle and turn into a new mussel.
Amazing. Do you know how mussels make the basal filament?
Oh, I'm not sure of the exact way that they make them. That's a good question. I know researchers are definitely trying to figure that out, like I mentioned. So, yeah, I'm not entirely sure, but we actually have another crab here, if we want to focus on that really quick. So we've been seeing these all day. These are striped shore crabs.
Oh,
did we get a look at it or
I
no?
think he just went out.
Oh, man. They're kind of
Oh,
shy.
but there is one behind you that's huge on that rock back there.
Oh!
Let's try and find it while I tell you a little bit more about the striped shore crab. So they're a pretty small species of crab. They're another type of crab that grows their own shell. And they are pretty shy creatures. They like to live in the crevices and the rocks of the intertidal, as you can see, to keep themselves safe. So that's a really cool thing to look at.
Yeah.
We've seen a lot of those today. Oh, are we looking at this one over here?
No, the one behind you on that big rock.
I can't see. Veronica, do you want to come point to what you're showing?
Sure,
I don't know what we're looking at here.
No worries. It's that big one right there who just crawled off.
Gotcha. Okay, now I see him. I was looking at the wrong rock for sure. Yeah, we can see him all the way back there. Kind of crawling out right now. That is a pretty big striped shore crab there. Oh, and there's another smaller one coming out too. Very cool.
Okay.
All right, do we have any more questions?
We do have a few more questions. We'll take a few more and then we'll continue. So,
All right, sounds good.
what is all the shedding we're seeing from mussels on the beach this time of year? I guess, why do we find more of their shells maybe on the beach?
Oh, that's a great question. I won't say that I know the exact answer, but one guess that I have is that right now there is a lot of domoic acid in the water. And that is something that happens when there's a lot of pollution in the water. It's actually making it so that the mussels here in California are not edible anymore. So I assume maybe some of them are getting sick, and that's why we might see more of their shells washed up.
Yeah. And then another mussel question. Oh, but I think this is more about barnacles. But
Okay.
how do barnacles make the cement? Do you know?
I do not know. Again, researchers are definitely trying to figure that out because these animals are so strong. So if we can figure out how these animals make that cement or make that basal filament, we can kind of apply that to our own lives and use that for stuff that we need strong stuff for.
And then we'll do one question
Okay.
about crabs. What do the crabs eat?
Ooh, that's a great question. So crabs will eat maybe small snails, and maybe small shrimp or isopods that they find living in the tide pool. So smaller creatures for sure. Cool. All right, then let's continue on by talking about a couple more different types of snails. So snails are some of the most common things that we might find in the intertidal. And one such snail is called a Kellett's whelk. So I found a shell here of the Kellett's whelk. And these are really interesting snails because they are carnivores, so they actually eat other snails. They have this really cool part of their body that they use to do that. It's called a proboscis, and it's kind of like an elephant trunk that they can use to search for animals underneath the sand, or to actually drill holes into the shells of other animals. So while it might not look like it, these snails are actually some very fierce predators. And Kellett's whelks, they also have another adaptation that helps them to live in the intertidal. So if I turn this shell over, we can't see this part of their body because the snail is no longer living, but they have a little circle that would go right here at the opening of their shell. And that is called an operculum. It's kind of like a trap door. So when the tide goes out, the snail can close their operculum, their trap door, and seal in any water inside of their shell to keep them from drying out in the sun and the wind when the tide is low. And again, that also can protect them from predators. Uh-oh. Might have died. I think it just died. All right, I will project. We'll leave this on though. So, I actually have a living snail that has an operculum. So I would like to go ahead and take that out now and show you guys. Let me grab him. give me just a second.
Could you tell us what you're doing?
So right now I am taking out a snail that we found earlier while exploring the tide pools. And this is a living snail called a Norris top snail. And this snail also has an operculum, so I want to take him out so that we can get a closer look at what I'm talking about. And now, if you are out exploring the tide pool, I do not recommend that you try and pick up any snails. I am a professional and I know how to do this, so I don't recommend that you guys do this just because we want to keep the snails safe. But here we can see this is a Norris top snail. So inside of their shell they have this soft body, and then here is their operculum, this little trap door here, that they can use to seal themselves inside of their shells. And again, that keeps them from drying out in the sun, and it protects them from predators. So really cool thing to see this Norris top snail. Let's take a look at its shell. It's also got some other little critters. Looks like maybe some limpets living on its shell as well. So very, very cool animal. Oh! Closed himself up a little bit. And they've got this really beautiful bright orange color. Alright. I'm going to go ahead and put this guy back in some water. And I will take out another snail that we found. So this snail is called a green bubble snail. And it doesn't actually look much like the other snails that we've seen today because it has a much smaller shell. So the shell, I think, is this part right here. And it's much smaller than the other shells that we have seen today. So we might call this shell vestigial. And what vestigial means is that this is a part of the snail's body that at one point might have been useful to it, but now it is no longer useful. It's kind of just left over. So they have this tiny little shell on their back. Let me put them in some water and see if we can get them to come out a little bit more. Yeah, I actually didn't know what kind of snail this was before first seeing it, so this was a new find for me as well. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and put this guy back in some water. And we can talk about one more type of snail. And this is the biggest snail that we might see here on the tide pools, and this is a wavy top turban snail. So this is just their shell, but it's still cool to take a look at. These are a really large turban snail. They can actually grow to about 6 inches, which is pretty cool. And unlike the Kellett's whelk, which is a carnivore, this guy is an herbivore. So the turban snail will eat things like kelp and algae. And they also would have an operculum. Again, right here where the opening of their shell would be, they would have that trap door, just like the Norris top snail, to close themselves into their shell. So that's a pretty common adaptation for snails to have, and a really important one for surviving life in the intertidal. Alright, let's take another question break.
Alright, so we've got quite a few questions. Are there any sea slugs here?
Ooh, we searched very long and hard to find some sea slugs. There definitely are some sea slugs here, but we didn't have any luck finding them today. But they do exist, and they are some of my favorite intertidal species. They're actually, some of them are called nudibranchs, and they come in lots of really beautiful colors. So I wish we could have found one to show you guys, but definitely recommend looking up some pictures because they are some cool animals.
Alright. How strong are the crabs? Can they protect themselves?
Ooh, can the crabs protect themselves? Yeah, I mean, their shells are pretty hard, so the purpose of their shell is to protect themselves, but they can actually be a little bit vulnerable. So when they molt, like this molt here, so when they shed their skin, right, they shed their exoskeleton and grow a new one, that is when the crab is most vulnerable because their new shell is not quite as hard as before. It's a little bit soft. So that's the time when the crab is a little bit less protected, but in general, their shells are nice and hard, and they've got these claws that they can use to protect themselves as well.
Okay. Are there any sea cucumbers here?
Oh, sea cucumbers. That's a really great question. We did not find any today, but sea cucumbers are another intertidal animal, so you might find one if you go out tide pooling.
Amazing. How big is the biggest snail that you have ever found?
That I have ever found. Well, I've found a turban snail about this size that was alive. I would say that that was probably the largest snail. Like I said, these turban snails are one of the largest snail species we can find here. So I've seen a living one of these that was pretty big, and that was also pretty cool. Oh, and also, yeah, that's a great point, the abalone. So unfortunately I didn't see this snail while it was alive, but this is a pretty big abalone shell. So another huge snail.
What would happen if a hermit crab was outside of its shell for a couple days?
Ooh, for a couple of days. Well, unfortunately, I think the hermit crab probably would not survive. They really rely on those shells for protection because the bodies inside of their shells are very, very soft. So I don't think that they would survive a couple of days, unfortunately.
Okay, and the last one I'm going to do for now. Why might a snail close its trapdoor? What animals might eat it?
Ooh, so birds would like to eat snails, and there are lots of birds exploring the tide pools with us today, and we'll talk about them in a little bit, but birds definitely are looking for snail snacks. And they would also close that door if there's not a lot of water around, so that they can seal some water inside of their shell so that they can keep breathing and that they don't dry out. So when the tide is out, that's usually when you might find a snail with their trapdoor, their operculum closed. Any other questions?
I think we can move on for now. We'll get to those after.
All right, then let's go ahead and move on. And I'd like to share with you guys some tide pooling tips. So going tide pooling is a really awesome way that we can connect with our environment and learn a little bit more about these creatures. So I highly recommend that you guys try it at least once. So I want to give you guys some tips if you guys do decide to go tide pooling. So my first tip is to make sure that you are walking very carefully in the tide pools. And that's for two reasons. One, it's pretty slippery out here, so you want to make sure you're being careful. And also, there are tons of animals everywhere, and they might be a little bit hard to spot. They might blend in. So I suggest you just look where you're going so you make sure that you're not hurting yourself or any of the animals in the tide pool. My second tip is to be patient. So when you arrive at a tide pool, you might not see something right away. You might have to wait a little bit and sit at the tide pool. And once you calm down and notice and wait, you might see some animals moving around like hermit crabs or snails. One more tip that I have for you guys, actually two more tips, is to be very gentle with the animals. So if you're not sure how to grab an animal, how to touch an animal, it's best to just use our eyes instead of grabbing things like snails or sea stars. And my very last tip for you guys is to use some resources. So you can get a field guide to go out to the tide pools that has a bunch of different animals in it, and you can try and identify what you're looking at. Or you can even use a really cool app. I use one that's called Seek. And if you've ever played Pokemon, it's kind of like a Pokedex. So you can take a picture of an animal or a plant, and then the app will try and tell you what you're looking at and give you some information about it. So that's a really cool app I recommend you try out if you're going tide pooling or even just going on a hike. Alright, but let's get back to talking about some animals. So I want to talk really quickly about some animals that don't necessarily live in the water but are very important to the tide pools. And one of those are birds. So out here in the tide pool, there's been some birds exploring along with us. You might see things like seagulls or egrets or cormorants. And these birds are having a great time because when the tide flows, it's kind of like an all-you-can-eat buffet for these animals. There's tons of food that is exposed for them. So you might see animals or some birds scavenging in the tide pool looking for a snack. Now one bird that is especially important to Coal Oil Point is the snowy plover. So here at Coal Oil Point, there's actually a protected area where these birds live because western snowy plovers are an endangered animal. So So here at Cool Oil Point, they have a nice fenced-off area for these birds to live and eat and sleep and lay their eggs. What's really, really cool is that they've been researching these populations, keeping track, and they have found that over 35 chicks hatch here each year, which is really, really awesome. And these snowy plovers eat things like invertebrates that live in the kelp that washes up. So they might eat kelp flies or beach hoppers. So they get a lot of nice snacks here, which leads me to the next thing that I want to talk about, which is kelp. So I'm going to walk, or actually, if you want to hand it to me, thank you. So here I have a piece of giant kelp, which is one of the more common pieces of algae that we might see wash up on the beach. So I want to tell you a little bit about what the different parts of the giant kelp. So out in the ocean, the kelp would be growing like this, and at the very bottom, there would be what's called a holdfast. And that is kind of like an anchor for the kelp. It keeps it locked on to the rocky bottom of the ocean. And this little tube that grows up is called the stipe. It's kind of like the stem of a terrestrial or a land plant. And off this stipe, we've got these blades of kelp. So these are kind of like the leaves. This is where the kelp is turning the sunlight into energy. And in between the stipe and the blade, we have a bladder. So that's this circle part right here. And this part is really interesting because it is actually filled with air. And that helps the kelp to grow upwards out in the ocean so that it can reach the light at the top. Now, when we have a lot of kelp growing in the same place, we might refer to that as a kelp forest. And kelp forests are really, really important for our Earth because they are home to a lot of different animals. A lot of animals eat there and find their food in the kelp forests. And these kelp forests are also really helpful for us as well because they help to take carbon dioxide out of the air. And carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about greenhouse gases, but I want to pause really quickly to answer a couple more questions.
Okay, I think we've got time for maybe 2 questions.
2 questions, great.
So, what is a crab's weak spot? Is it its underbelly, or are there any other spots?
Oh, I think that it would be their underbelly, right? The hard shell is on top, and on the bottom it might be a little bit softer.
Awesome. And then the next one is, what is the largest sea animal that you have found?
Ooh. That I've ever seen, the largest sea animal that I've ever seen is a humpback whale, which is really, really cool. But here in the tide pools, it would probably be a snail. All right. Oh my goodness. Sorry, the crab just crawled on my feet. It scared me a little bit. Sorry about that. But I want to continue to talk about these greenhouse gases and some threats that our ocean is facing. So greenhouse gases are things like carbon dioxide and methane. And these gases form a nice blanket around our Earth. They form a nice sphere around our Earth. And these greenhouse gases are really important because they trap some of the heat from the sun and keep our Earth nice and warm for us to live in. But when we make a ton of extra carbon dioxide and methane, we can make that blanket of greenhouse gases really, really thick, trapping a lot more heat in our atmosphere. And that can lead to things like extreme weather, rising temperatures, and rising ocean temperatures, which can be really, really bad for the animals that live in the ocean. So kelp forests are a great way that we can try to take some of that carbon dioxide, some of that greenhouse gas out of our air. Now, another threat that is facing our ocean is pollution. So the intertidal zone, the tide pools, are the very end of our watersheds. So a watershed is an area of land where all of the water drains to one spot. And here on the coast, all of that water ends up going into the ocean. And what that means is that the intertidal is kind of right at the end of our watershed. So any pollution that is on our watersheds in our land, even if it's not close to the ocean, can get swept up and end up in the ocean or in the intertidal. And once it's in the ocean, we call that marine debris. So today we actually found some marine debris here, and this is one of the worst kinds of marine debris because it is plastic. And plastic doesn't break down. Man, these crabs are crawling all over me, sorry. This plastic doesn't break down. It takes a really, really long time. We actually aren't even sure how long it takes for plastic to break down. Instead, it can just break down into smaller and smaller pieces known as microplastics. And that's a really not great thing because a lot of animals might mistake these microplastics for food. So that is one type of pollution that is really, really harmful to our oceans. And one more type of pollution I want to talk about is nutrient pollution. So nutrients are kind of like vitamins for our earth. But if we take a whole bottle of vitamins, we might not feel so good, right? And that's kind of what nutrient pollution is it is way too many nutrients at one time. And that can cause a lot of bad things to go on out in our ocean. For example, it can cause algae blooms, which is actually what's going on in our oceans right now. And these algae blooms are releasing a toxin that I mentioned a little bit earlier, and that is domoic acid. And that can be really harmful to the marine mammals out there and to the mussels, like I said earlier. So if you might have seen or heard about animals washing up on the beach, that is one really big reason for that. It's because of nutrient pollution and domoic acid. But I want to talk about some ways that we can help, some things that we can do to solve these problems. So one thing that we can do is make sure that we are picking up all of our trash, right? All of the plastic, any sort of trash, our dog poop, right? We want to make sure that we are not leaving anything behind in our environment because then it can end up going into our ocean. Now, one more thing I want to talk about that's kind of special to Coal Oil Point is the oil platform that's out here. So I'm going to walk around here so we can take a look at it. Can we see it? So right out there in the ocean is platform holly. So that is an oil rig out there that we call platform holly. And in 2015, there was a big oil spill, a leak from this oil rig. And that means that they actually shut this oil rig down, so it's not functioning anymore. And Santa Barbara kind of has a history with these types of things. In fact, in 1969, there was a huge oil spill that actually led to the creation of Earth Day. So it's not great when these things happen, when these oil spills happen, but it's great to see community coming together to try and come up with ideas and ways to protect our environment. And one thing that we can all do is we can just keep learning about how we can help our environment, keep learning about the animals and plants that live here, and keep developing a relationship to them so that we care for them and we try to find ways to protect them. All right. I want to end if there's any last questions or...
Okay. Are tide pool creatures afraid of us, or are we afraid of them?
That is a great question. I think they're definitely more afraid of us than we are of them, right? Because we are a lot bigger than them. Most of the animals in the tide pool are completely harmless. The one thing you might want to watch out for are the crab's pinchers. But other than that, we are much bigger, so I think that they are more scared of us than we are of them.
Doesn't nutrient overflow, or I think pollution, cause algae blooms? Is red algae bad?
Yes, exactly. So when there are a lot of nutrients out in our ocean, that can cause algae blooms, like the red algae. And those are not good for our environment because that algae releases some bad stuff into the water, like domoic acid, that can really harm the animals that live in our ocean. All right. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us for Terrific Tide Pools. I hope you guys learned a little bit more about our tide pools and know what you guys can do to help protect our tide pools. What was that? You just say it. Can you, Veronica?
Yes. Okay. We also want to give a big shout out to the county's Project Clean Water, who helps fund these tide pool events. Like Kara said, if you have any questions that didn't get answered, we will send you a response and also include some pictures of some cool stuff we took today.
Yes.
And I hope you go out and enjoy your tide pools.
Thank you for joining us.